Hello everyone, I'm Sport, and I'll be introducing you to our project. Basically, our task was to identify the relationship between drugs and politics and their effects on demographics, as well as demographics' effects on drugs and politics. Obviously, these three things are inherently related to one another, and they kind of affect each other in a bunch of different ways. And so just to start off, I want to clarify what we mean by drugs, because according to the dictionary, drugs are basically any substance that you ingest that have a physiological effect on you. So that could be anything from melatonin to cyanide. So I want to kind of narrow down the definition a little bit, and Gavin will go over this in a little bit more detail during his part. But basically what we mean by drugs in this project are drugs used recreationally, simply meaning outside of modern medical practice, so not an anesthetic, not something that would be directly to fix a sickness or something like that, just used outside of modern medical practice. So ayahuasca we're calling a recreational drug, even though you might say it's used for medical purposes, which is totally fine. Just we're saying it's outside of the context of a modern, like, American hospital style drug. And so that with that narrow definition of drugs, that's basically what we're talking about from now on. So now every time someone mentions drugs, we're not talking about melatonin. So basically now for the rest of this video, Shelby will go over the interviews that she got and some of the specific personal stories and bits of information on how drugs can affect certain people and how drugs are seen in certain aspects of life. Then Gavin will give a basic overview of how drug policy is in the United States today, how the DEA classifies drugs and enforces against them. Thirdly, Cam Cameron will talk about how demographics are involved in drugs and how drugs have had different impacts on different demographics as well as their enforcement. And then finally, we will go to Johnathon, who will talk about the history of drug enforcement in the United States and how demographics has been involved in that process. And so yeah, I will see you and at the final conclusion of this thing. Hand it over to Shelby.
Hi guys, my name is Shelby Newton, and during this project, I had the privilege of being tasked with the interview portion. I was able to get a hold of two amazing people who were able to give me the effects and the consequences of drugs within their industry and what they have seen so far. So I just wanted to rehash a little bit of what was said and what had happened in the short time span that we have. And so the first person I had interviewed was Master Sergeant Justin Newton, who has been a part of our U.S. military for 20 years. And I just wanted to get an insight of what the federal government views on on drugs in general. So a little quick rehash of some of the questions I had asked was, what is the government's view on drugs? What I found particularly interesting was, although you can be residing in a state that may legalize marijuana, you can't partake in it because that's on the state level and the government is on the federal level. You learn something new every day. Another really interesting fact that I thought he had was, although you could be using hardcore drugs, or whether it was a lesser of a drug like weed, military personnel, it's the same consequence, whether it was a harder drug or if it was a lesser drug, because the military views it as a drug. No matter what kind, it's a drug. They're all treated the same. You all get the same consequence for different drugs, which I thought was really interesting, unlike a civilian. The next person I was able to interview was a nurse who's worked as a mental health and rehabilitation at a rehabilitation center. And she was able to give me what she has seen firsthand of what drugs can do. Some of the psychological effects that she has personally seen has been dementia, paranoia, delusions. These are some of the effects that she has seen on the patients that she has treated, and which I thought was psychological, I feel, is way more important than physical, because that is where your body functions. That's what your body tells what to do. Another really interesting fact was I had asked her the difference that she sees in drugs in women and in men. And she sees more men than she does women, because men have a higher tolerance and a bigger build to obtain drugs at a higher amount, which I thought was really interesting, because I guess when you think about it, it would make sense that men could take in more drugs and be less affected than women, but it was fun to learn. Overall, I really enjoyed it.
Good afternoon, everyone. my name is Gavin Garcia. I conducted research on the Drug Enforcement Administration and how they schedule specific drugs. First, I'll be going through Schedule 1, and then I'll end with Schedule 5. Schedule 1 drugs have a high potential to be abused. It's not used for acceptable medical treatments in the United States. The use of the substance is not safe, even if used under medical supervision. And some examples of Schedule 1 drugs are heroin, GHB, and LSD. Schedule 2 drugs also have a high potential to be abused. They are used in acceptable medical treatments in the United States, or they're used in medical treatments with very severe restrictions. The drug creates severe addiction physically and psychologically. Some examples of Schedule 2 would include morphine, cocaine, and methamphetamine. Schedule 3 drugs have less potential to be abused compared to the other drugs found in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. They are used in acceptable medical treatments in the United States. Now, the substance leads to moderate or low physical addiction or high psychological addiction. Some examples of Schedule 3 would be anabolic steroids, codeine with aspirin, or codeine with acetaminophen. Schedule 4 drugs have a low potential to be abused compared to the other drugs found in Schedule 3. It is used in acceptable medical treatments in the United States. The substance leads to less severe physical and psychological addiction compared to the substances listed under Schedule 3. Some examples of Schedule 4 drugs are alprazolam and diazepam. Schedule 5 drugs have a low potential to be abused compared to the other drugs found in Schedule 4. It is used in acceptable medical treatments in the United States. This substance leads to less severe physical and psychological addiction compared to the other drugs listed under Schedule 4. An example of a Schedule 5 drug would be cough medicine with codeine. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Kameron Cox, and I'm here to talk about demographics and how they affect drug use and drug incarceration rates in the United States and worldwide. So the first factor I wanted to talk about was religious and spiritual beliefs. So as we've talked about in class, different cultures around the world, past and present, use entheogens as a way to increase consciousness and become enlightened in different ways. Now, in the United States, peyote is one of the only entheogens that's legal in any capacity, and it's only strictly for these spiritual and religious purposes. Now, other than that, it's a Schedule 1 drug, and all these other entheogens are unavailable legally in the United States. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have religions like the LDS Church, which believe in strict abstinence from drugs such as alcohol or marijuana or tobacco, things like that, in any capacity. And they believe that drug use is only strictly for medicinal purposes, things like Advil and other over-the-counter drugs that are common in the United States. So obviously your religious and spiritual beliefs may affect greatly how you look at drugs, how you use them, if you use them, and whether those drugs are legal for you or not in the US. Now, another factor that affects drug incarceration and arrest rates is your race. So even though white people and black people use drugs at similar rates, black men are about 14 times more likely than white men to be arrested for drug use. And in addition, where you're from and your nationality can affect how drugs are treated in your country and how drug use is viewed. So countries like Portugal, since 2003, have decriminalized drugs and have turned to drug rehab as their primary method of dealing with drug users. And even state to state in the United States, such as Oregon, following Portugal's example this past election and voting for decriminalizing many drugs, or at least reducing the penalties and focusing more on drug rehabilitation. So obviously many demographic factors affect how people use drugs, what they think about using drugs, and what the consequences will be for drug use.
Hi, my name is Johnathon, and my focus for our project was history of drug laws in America. What I learned can be broken down into 4 sections. The first of which is called the pre-prohibition age and spans from the founding of the U.S. through to the year 1910. And throughout this entire era, there were no federal laws that directly limited the use of any drug. There were only state laws that targeted the facilities where drug use was common, most notably the opium dens of Chinese immigrants. And these laws were definitely racially motivated. They were definitely racist. Because most of the drug users during this era were white, upper class, and middle class women. The second era is called is what I like to call the era of prohibition, which is when the prohibition was. And not only was there the prohibition, but there was a push in the Deep South to ratify laws that incarcerated cocaine addicted individuals, which were notably black communities, which were most notably in black communities, I should say. And then there was also the push to legalize marijuana, which happened all over the U.S. and was almost exclusively targeting Mexican immigrants that were escaping the Civil War in Mexico. The third era is the war against drugs, when President Nixon passed the infamous Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in 1970, and many of the previous prohibitory laws were revamped and magnified. Drug arrests and incarceration skyrocketed, and the laws that were targeted the heaviest just so happened to be used by Nixon's greatest criticizers, which were liberal young adults and African Americans. And as the war on drugs escalated during later administrations, these communities were further and further decentralized. Finally, the last era was the modern era, which is right now, and it begins at the turn of the century. And these past 21 years have seen the greatest relaxation of mandatory minimums and support for legalization and decriminalization of all drugs. And it's all very exciting stuff that can be read about in my research paper. But for now, since I'm running out of time, I gotta give the camera over to my next groupmate.
Alright, everyone, so as you can see, there's a lot of different ideas and history regarding this complicated relationship, and hope you enjoyed this video. This is our project, and I guess it's time for us to answer your questions.